This week we are examining some of the basic principles of ecological restoration. In this lecture I want to introduce you to Tony Bradshaw, who suggested that restoration is often viewed as the acid test of our understanding of an ecosystem. My primary objective with this lecture material is to explore what this actually means and how we can use that to guide our approach to ecological restoration. A second objective is to explore how this framework can be used to define other terms related to restoration that we will discuss in more detail throughout the semester. So before we get to actually exploring what the definition of an acid test actually means, let's spend a few minutes and introduce Tony Bradshaw. Tony Bradshaw was a British scientist who spent most of the second half of the 20th century successfully straddling the divide between fundamental and applied science, making major contributions to our understanding of evolution in plant populations and the significance of phenotypic plasticity. He then used this knowledge to develop new science-based techniques for restoration of degraded ecosystems. And because of these contributions and ability to bridge this theoretical to applied science, he is considered to be one of the founders of the field of restoration ecology. In 2010, the Royal Society published a short biography that is available online and listed here on the slide that I would encourage you to read if you get a chance, as it's an interesting background and read on the interesting life of Tony Bradshaw. He began his career in the Department of Agricultural Botany at Bangor University in Wales, and in 1968 moved to the University of Liverpool as a professor of botany. Like Leopold, he was extremely curious about ecosystems and how they were put together, and he was particularly curious about plant evolution and how soil affects this evolution, and often used highly degraded sites in his research. And in one highly influential study comparing plant growth on soil heaps from an old lead mine as compared to an adjacent pasture no more than 100 meters away, he demonstrated a classic example of population differentiation, where the plants from the pasture that were transplanted onto the mine spoil all died due to failure of root growth. These experiments led to further work on metal tolerance of plants, and once he moved to Liverpool, he began really working on concepts associated with restoration ecology, using his knowledge to focus on understanding broader ecosystem functions, especially those that regulated soil fertility, to help guide restorations of degraded lands across Britain. These efforts led him to work with a broad range of agencies and private companies to solve their environmental issues. And as one might expect, someone who appeared next to Charles Darwin in the Environmental Agency's poll of top 100 eco-heroes of all time, he was a Fellow of the Royal Society and President of the British Ecological Society. He was also passionate about certification and helped create the Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management in the UK, which is a leading ecological certification institute. And one of Dr. Bradshaw's greatest contributions, however, was really his recognition long before it became vogue of the importance of understanding and communicating research impact. He believed it was really critical that we apply good science to improve our environment, and he practiced locally what he preached up to his death in 2008, being an important advocate for various restoration projects in the Liverpool area. So in 1987, Dr. Bradshaw wrote the following: "Like watch repair, restoration is a considerable intellectual challenge, requiring that we understand not only the nature of the ecosystem itself, but also the nature of the damage and how to repair it. Hence my assertion that restoration is an acid test of our understanding." So what does this really mean? What is an acid test? Well, perhaps it's best to start by asking what is meant by this acid test. And the Oxford Dictionary defines an acid test as a conclusive test of the success or value of something. And if you look back at how It is believed that this term acid test has been derived. Oxford continues that the origin of the term is believed to come from the original use, denoting a test for gold using nitric acid. You would take nitric acid, drop it onto a piece of metal, and that acid test would tell you whether you were dealing with 24 karat gold or not. And so the true test of whether a material is gold or not comes from its response to the application of the acid. In the same way, we can apply that understanding to a question, and that can be our acid test. So this means we need to understand an ecosystem if we are going to restore that ecosystem. And we need sufficient knowledge if we are going to assist in the recovery of an ecosystem to one that Bradshaw suggested was vigorous and healthy, his definition of what a restored ecosystem looks like. In other words, we need to understand the processes that drive ecosystem development, both in our original or reference ecosystem as well as the degraded ecosystem. So let's take the example of a jack pine forest ecosystem that you see here in northern lower Michigan. This natural stand of jack pine, Pinus banksiana, experienced a wildfire, and this picture was taken about 6 months after following the wildfire. To successfully restore these ecosystems that have been heavily impacted by timber harvesting, agricultural conversion, as well as active fire suppression for the last 80 years, we need to understand the effects of stand replacing wildfire, as this is the major natural disturbance that is responsible for the renewal regeneration of the primary component of these species, including jack pine. There are specific attributes of these stands following a stand replacing wildfire. Things such as standing dead snags that you see here that have attracted all kinds of insects, that now these are wood-boring insects that are boring into the wood, and you can see all of the sawdust at the base of the trees that is helping to add organic matter back to this bare mineral soil where that organic matter has been consumed by the wildfire. There's also a very open canopy, right? A lot of sunlight reaching the forest floor that's going to favor the establishment of these shade-intolerant species, such as jack pine. So it's rehabilitating, it's bringing that ecosystem back and promoting the regeneration of jack pine. This is a species that has evolved over millennia with these stand-replacing wildfire. And so if we're effectively going to restore these ecosystems, we need to understand these processes, the attributes or components that develop following these processes. What we'll find that in your next lecture that I'm going to have you watch, a lecture provided by Jerry Franklin, who's termed these biological legacies, right? The importance of these biological legacies and how we can use that information to help design effective strategies to enhance these attributes and these processes. So in this way, restoration really is the acid test of our understanding of an ecosystem, because if we do not understand the processes at work in the ecosystem, we are unlikely to be able to reconstruct it so that it is healthy and vigorous and meets the conditions of a restored ecosystem that we covered in the last lecture. So let's take a little closer look at what we mean by ecosystem attributes. Remember that when we consider ecological restoration, we really want to focus on restoring functions and processes. And while we can focus on individual species or in individual communities, this can be problematic as it is these processes and functions that allow these species and communities to persist. In many examples where we only focus on trying to restore habitat for a specific species or a specific species itself without focusing on the underlying ecosystem processes, these types of restoration plans often fail. So a good place to start when thinking about ecosystem attributes is the environment, which includes both the physical and chemical components of the ecosystem. It can also be considered the habitat that the organisms utilize. We can also simplify another group of ecosystem attributes into structural components, which include species and populations, communities and assemblages of plants and animals, and the trophic structures associated with these organisms. These structural attributes also include habitat, which you can see by these two circles overlapping in this Venn diagram. These structural attributes include the habitat, and we are often concerned with things such as diversity and complexity, structural complexity, when we think about these types of components. And by this might mean the arrangement of snags and other legacies of the disturbance that are critical habitat components that are going to be critical in helping drive the structure of our plant and animal communities. Finally, we can group attributes related to productivity and cycling of nutrients, for example, into a group of ecosystem attributes defined as ecosystem functions. And while most of our activities may directly manipulate the environmental attributes, we are looking for a response in the structural and functional attributes associated with our ecosystems when we think about restoration. So let's look at another quick example, this time from a fire-dependent ponderosa pine forest in Colorado. We can identify a variety of ecosystem attributes here on the slide, including soils with different chemical and physical characteristics between the blackened areas and those with dead grass cover. We have both live and dead trees that provide habitat for a variety of organisms, right? Cavity nesting birds are going to utilize this habitat in this structure. And you'll also see that there's a specific spatial arrangement to the structure of these trees and in snags that's going to be an important characteristic of a disturbed ecosystem that we may want to emulate or replicate in our restored ecosystem. We can also imagine how the wildfire that has gone through this ponderosa pine forest and its impact on the environment and plant and animal communities will influence other structural characteristics such as plant diversity and the assemblages of fire-dependent wildlife. We can also start to surmise what these changes in the environment and structure mean for things such as nutrient cycling, water availability, changes in transpiration, for example, with the loss of this ponderosa pine canopy that may increase water yield and increase water movement off these sites, and overall ecosystem productivity, all examples of ecosystem functions that we can now start to visualize on a landscape like we see here on the slide. So one of the things that Bradshaw did so well in his 1987 work, this seminal work, was to simplify these important attributes or components into a simple graphical representation of restoration and relate them directly to activities that are associated with restoration in thinking about how this all relates from an original ecosystem back to a degraded ecosystem. So if we look to reproduce this graph and provide kind of a framework for you as we move through the rest of the semester and talk about concepts and principles associated with ecosystem restoration, let's try to produce this. And the first thing we can do is start by setting ecosystem structure as our x-axis and ecosystem function as our y-axis. And recall that these are the two primary groups of ecosystem components that we really want to focus on, that structure and function that are reflective of those important ecosystem processes that drive ecosystem development. And so note that both are increasing along the axis, each axis, and keep in mind that this is really a theoretical construct, all right? It allows us to view restoration in relative terms with respect to changes in ecosystem structure and function. So if we were to plot the original ecosystem along these two axes relative to a degraded ecosystem, we would place it somewhere here on the upper right. And then as the ecosystem is degraded by some suite of anthropogenic activities, there will be a decline in ecosystem structure and function, placing the degraded ecosystem in the lower left of the graph, with relative to the original ecosystem less structure, and less function. And remember that these are, again, our relative relationships. So from this graph, we can clearly see the objective of restoration is we are to restore some original ecosystem condition. And that means we need to focus on increasing structural and functional attributes of the degraded ecosystem so that we again approach that of the original ecosystem. In this case, both components will have been impacted and will need to be restored if we are going to be thinking about true ecological restoration. In some cases, we may make progress towards this original state, to our reference condition, but we may not achieve it fully. In this case, we can view this as rehabilitation if we have restored some ecosystem structural and functional components. And perhaps over time, and depending on the ecosystem in question, natural processes may take over, and our initial rehabilitation efforts may have placed this ecosystem, this degraded ecosystem, back on a developmental trajectory that is going to lead back to the structure and function associated with the original or reference ecosystem. So in other words, our restoration activities may have put this ecosystem back on the road to recovery through these rehabilitation efforts. There's also the case where we restore a suite of ecosystem functions, but find it is difficult to restore ecosystem structure, leading to what we might call ecosystem replacement, or as Bradshaw called, reclamation. Such situations are more common than you may think, and one only has to look to land reclamation efforts following surface mining for coal in Ohio to see some classic examples of this. Efforts to return the mine land back to a natural contour and establish vegetation quickly to help restore important ecosystem functions such as nutrient cycling and preventing erosion have led to practitioners and restoration ecologists to focus on using grassland communities to quickly revegetate the site, hold the soil in place, and start some of this nutrient recycling and increase the productivity of the site back to an original state. In this case, we've successfully in some ways restored ecosystem function, but the structure of that plant community is entirely different what was there prior to the mining activity, which would have been a deciduous forest, likely dominated by oak or maple, right? And so because those grassland communities don't necessarily reflect that original community, we really have done very little to restore ecosystem structure. And in this case, we might call that reclamation or ecosystem replacement. Finally, it is important to note that for some ecosystems and conditions, it is possible that if given enough time, natural processes will track this development or this restoration track from a degraded to an original ecosystem. For instance, it's possible that secondary successional processes can be harnessed for many eastern deciduous forests in North America that will eventually lead to a condition that is similar to the original forest given enough time. And by enough time here, I'm talking perhaps centuries that we would actually see forests that develop following some significant anthropogenic disturbance that would emulate or have conditions, structural and functional conditions that are similar to our reference or original ecosystem. However, as we introduce more pests and pathogens such as emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, hemlock woolly adelgid, and we explore possible changes with climate change or acid deposition through acid rain, these ecosystems may become less resilient over time, and managing these natural processes may not be successful as they have been in the past, and we may not have them as critical components or tools that we can use in our restoration toolbox. So related to this final point, I would argue that understanding natural disturbance processes are going to be very important to you as a restoration ecologist and practitioner. And that's why in the next lecture, we will focus on understanding a little bit about natural disturbances, what they are, and how we can use them as a guide to direct ecosystem restoration practices. So there's one more point that I want to share with you regarding these relationships. And I don't recall the reference for this figure, so I apologize for that. But this is a figure that we used a long time ago in a watershed restoration class that we offered here at Ohio State, but haven't offered in the last couple of years. And what you'll see for the most part is that this graph, this representation of the watershed restoration process, closely resembles that we just walked through that was developed by Bradshaw, with these added gray clouds surrounding both the original and degraded conditions of the watershed. Okay, and I think this is an important point and one that I want to bring up here, because that idea is that there's this idea of natural variation associated with ecosystems. And the likelihood that we ever attain the exact same ecosystem structure and function is highly unlikely, if not impossible. Okay, and so that's what you have here with these clouds around the original historic watershed condition and the existing watershed condition, right? There's a cloud, a suite of natural variability that's associated with stochastic and random events that occur in nature that are going to direct ecosystems to a certain structural and functional condition. So it's important that we have some idea of this historical variation in ecosystem structure and function that's associated with our original ecosystem and the degraded ecosystem we are trying to restore, as this provides us with a better idea of whether we have been successful in restoring the degraded ecosystem. Okay, so it's an important concept, kind of this natural historical variation that we'll come back to over time across the semester when we talk about different specific restoration activities. So let's return to this acid test reference. So it should be clear to you at this point what Bradshaw meant when he described restoration as our acid test for ecology. To effectively restore an ecosystem, we must understand the ecosystem processes that result in the original ecosystem to be restored. It should then follow as well that this relationship is reciprocal, as any attempt to reconstruct an ecosystem is a test of our knowledge of that ecosystem. So when viewed in this way, we shouldn't really consider failures as total failures. Rather, these experiences can really help us reveal gaps in our understanding that we can address through research and adaptive restoration efforts. And finally, as I indicated in the previous slide, there is always the chance that the recovery of an ecosystem is due to some natural process and not necessarily our restoration activities. And this is where experimental approaches in restoration ecology and an adaptive management approach that Matt so effectively discussed earlier in the week, that really can be helpful in disentangling these relationships. So let's end this lecture with a real-world example that hopefully reinforces what I've walked through with you here today. So almost 20 years ago now, there was this short news and comment article published in the journal Science with the rather provocative title, "Restored Wetlands Flunk Real-World Test." And I've put the complete citation on the further reading slide here at the end of the lecture in case you want to go and actually read the short news article in the journal Science. So here's the basic story. In the mid-1980s, as part of a wetland mitigation plan, a small 2-hectare wetland was created south of San Diego to replace wetlands that had been destroyed by construction projects around the San Diego area. And of particular interest to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, these restored wetlands were supposed to provide important habitat for this endangered light-footed clapper rail, which you see here on the screen. And so the designers and environmental engineers that helped develop the wetland assumed that once the site had been graded back to the right slope and that the tidal flow had been reconnected to the site, so the hydrology had been kind of restored, that nature would slowly help the site recover and provide much needed habitat for this endangered light-footed clapper rail, but also 2 other endangered species, the least tern and a small plant known as bird's beak. And so as part of this restoration plan, the engineers went over to a nearby wetland and collected Spartina cordgrass, which is a native wetland plant that's known to be important habitat for this light-footed clapper rail. And they transplanted that cordgrass from those nearby wetlands into this restored wetland to provide habitat structure for the clapper rail. About this time that this was going on, Dr. Joyce Zedler, who's currently a leading scientist and restoration ecologist at the University of Wisconsin up in Madison, was on the faculty at San Diego State, and along with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, started exploring how well these restored wetlands were functioning. And after a 10-year study, they came to the conclusion that the reason why the clapper rails were not utilizing this restored wetland in the way that was intended was that the cordgrass would not grow high enough to actually be utilized by the clapper rail. Clapper rail was discovered really want to see this Spartina cordgrass to be at least 90 centimeters tall, and it wasn't reaching that height. And Dr. Zedler and her team found that the sandy, nutrient-poor soil where this wetland, this mitigation wetland, had been developed really was so nutrient poor that it would not support a productive stand of cordgrass, right? Which then led to a second idea, was that, well, if it's not tall enough because the environmental conditions are not conducive enough to promote the kind of productivity that we need to see in terms of the functional process on these restored wetlands, well, maybe we can add fertilizers to this site and increase the height, the growth rate and the height, and then the clapper rail will use this. So they went out and added some nitrogen-based fertilizers, which then had the unintended consequence of allowing another wetland plant to outcompete the cordgrass. Right, so then they lost the cordgrass, as well as in areas where the cordgrass grew well, it became more susceptible to a small scale insect, which then had a negative influence on the overall health of the cordgrass stands. After 10 years as well, Zedler and her team also found that this restored wetland accumulated less nitrogen and produced less organic matter than a nearby reference wetland, right? Leading them, Zedler's team, to really conclude that this constructed wetland was less than 60% equivalent to the natural marshes and wetlands that they were using as reference states. And so in this example, we can really see how a focus on one ecosystem component, that Spartina cordgrass, and just getting it there on site, kind of the if we build it, they will come type of field of dreams reference that we often see in restoration ecology, and really focusing on that and not on the important ecosystem processes such as nutrient cycling, right? And the competitive relationships and competition and diversity really led to a failed restoration attempt, right? And while some argued that, well, over time, maybe another 10, 15, 20 years, these restored wetlands would actually more closely approximate after they build up some of that organic matter. One thing we can say here is that by not focusing on understanding how the ecosystem worked and applying this knowledge to design a restored ecosystem, that really led to a less than successful restoration effort than what was intended. And a lot of money and resources went in to developing these mitigation wetlands to restore this important habitat. And so to me, it's a great example of what Bradshaw called our acid test of ecology. We really need to understand how that ecosystem worked, how it was put together, if we're going to then go out and reconstruct it. And so that's where I'd like to end today. You can If you're interested in some further reading, you can go back to the original 1987 paper by Bradshaw, The Reclamation of Derelict Land and the Ecology of Ecosystems, in a really nice text, Restoration Ecology. And then the short news report, Restored Wetlands Flunked Real World Tests, by David Malakoff in the journal Science.